October 12, 1943, 28,000 feet above occupied France. Hman Klaus Veber adjusted his oxygen mask and peered through the crystal-clear canopy of his Fauler Wolf 190A6, watching the ungainly American fighters climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 couldn't suppress a smirk as he studied these newcomers making their combat debut over Europe. "Mein Gott, they've sent us flying refrigerators," he transmitted to his wingman, unable to contain his amusement at the sight of 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggling for altitude below. These corpulent American machines appeared almost comical compared to the sleek Messerschmitts and nimble Spitfires German pilots had grown accustomed to facing. Barrel-shaped fuselages crowned with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed impossibly small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Weber didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves in the thin air could have possibly imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying refrigerators would transform from objects of derision into instruments of absolute terror, their 8 synchronized Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 3 seconds. The transformation began that crisp October morning when Major Robert Johnson, commanding the 61st Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran understood what his green pilots didn't yet grasp. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from conventional fighter philosophy. While the Germans pursued lightweight interceptors, optimized for climb and maneuverability, Republic Aviation had created something unprecedented. A high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, and overwhelming firepower to redefine aerial warfare. Among the 60 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on October 12, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939, with veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This story reveals how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity merged with quality to create overwhelming superiority, how German laughter turned to terror as they discovered what synchronized American machine guns could accomplish at 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from June 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the US Army Air Forces. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that redefined possibility. "It will be enormous," Kartveli admitted to his design team. "But it will be enormous with perfect proportions." The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who witnessed it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor. The massive turbo supercharger system, with complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching the beast inevitably asked the same question. This thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere where conventional superchargers failed. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing, torque-rolled on takeoff, and dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility. Their controls froze as shockwaves formed on the wings. But those who mastered the beast discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces, described his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first combat encounters in spring 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. P-47s couldn't turn with the Fauler Wolf 190s, couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109s, couldn't match their nimble handling at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics exploiting these weaknesses, attacking from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled, forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. Statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested Americans might reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was unbuckling and running around the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to notice. P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped liquid-cooled fighters cold. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters or cannon with limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute. 8 guns created a wall of lead that nothing could survive. Weber and his wingman dove on the American formation that October morning, confident in their superiority. They had speed, they had altitude, they had experience. What they didn't have was any understanding of what they were about to face. The lead Thunderbolt, flown by Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, spotted the attacking Germans and called out their position. His voice carried clearly through the crystal-clear frequency modulation radios that equipped every American fighter. Something else the Germans didn't know existed. As Weber closed to firing range, Mahurin's Thunderbolts seemed to hang motionless in the sky, too slow to evade, too clumsy to maneuver. Weber pressed his firing button, watching his cannon shells streak toward the fat American fighter. Several hits sparkled along the wing and fuselage. The P-47 should have exploded or at least caught fire. Instead, it rolled inverted and dove. Weber followed, confident his superior Fauler Wolf could match any American aircraft in a dive. What happened next defied every assumption about aerodynamics and combat performance. The Thunderbolt accelerated like a stone dropped from heaven, quickly outdistancing the German fighter despite Weber's best efforts. At 400 miles per hour, then 450, then an impossible 500 miles per hour, the massive American fighter pulled away as if Weber's aircraft was standing still. In the cockpit of his diving Thunderbolt, Captain Mahurin felt the familiar sensation of immense power under perfect control. The P-47 was built for this moment. Its massive weight, initially seen as a liability, became its greatest asset in vertical flight. German fighters, optimized for agility, simply couldn't compete with the Thunderbolt's ability to convert altitude into devastating speed. At the bottom of his dive, Mahurin pulled back on the stick and felt the tremendous G-forces as his aircraft converted speed back into altitude. The zoom climb that followed left Weber's Fauler Wolf wallowing in thin air, unable to follow. This was the revelation American pilots were beginning to understand. Don't fight the Germans on their terms. Use the Thunderbolt's unique capabilities to dictate the engagement. Weber, stunned by what he'd witnessed, radioed his observations to the rest of his formation. Achtung, the American fighters have unusual diving performance. Do not follow them down. But his warning came too late. Across the sky, other German pilots were discovering the same shocking reality. Lieutenant Hans Dortenmann, flying with Weber's squadron, had selected what appeared to be an easy target. A lone Thunderbolt separated from its formation, seemingly vulnerable. As Dortenmann positioned for attack, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The American aircraft wasn't trying to evade. It was turning toward him. Second Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, the son of Polish immigrants who would become America's top ace in Europe, had spotted the approaching Messerschmitt and made a calculated decision. Rather than attempt impossible evasive maneuvers, he would use the P-47's greatest advantage: its guns. The convergence pattern of 850 caliber machine guns created a killing zone unlike anything in aviation history. Each weapon fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself represented American industrial sophistication: hardened steel cores wrapped in copper jackets, tipped with incendiary compounds that ignited on impact. At 300 yards, Gabreski pressed his firing button. The Thunderbolt shuddered as all 8 guns spoke simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything German pilots had experienced. Not the sharp crack of cannon fire or the rapid chatter of rifle-caliber weapons, but a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to tear the very air apart. Dortenmann's Messerschmitt disappeared in a cloud of aluminum fragments and burning fuel. The concentration of firepower was so intense that the aircraft simply disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselage, tail section severed, cockpit obliterated. The German pilot never had time to realize what killed him. Weber watched in horror as his wingman was transformed from a fighting aircraft into falling debris in less than 2 seconds. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German pilots had grown accustomed to prolonged dogfights where aircraft absorbed multiple hits before going down. This was execution by overwhelming firepower. The engagement that began with German confidence ended with German retreat. Of the 12 Fauler Wolf 190s that attacked the American formation, 3 were destroyed and 2 damaged beyond repair. The P-47s returned to base without loss, though several bore the scars of German cannon fire that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. In the debriefing rooms at Jagdgeschwader 26's airfield, German pilots struggled to comprehend what they'd witnessed. The Americans hadn't outflown them in any traditional sense. The Thunderbolts were still slower in level flight, still couldn't turn as tightly, still climbed poorly at low altitude. But they'd introduced new rules to aerial combat. Hauptmann Prehler's initial assessment was rapidly evolving. The American fighters possess unusual characteristics, he reported to headquarters. Their diving speed exceeds our aircraft significantly. Their firepower appears concentrated and devastating. Recommend further study of engagement tactics. But German intelligence was slow to adapt. Reports of P-47 capabilities were dismissed as exaggeration or attributed to pilot error. The institutional arrogance that had served Germany well in early victories now became a liability. They couldn't accept that American industrial methods had produced a fighter that, while different from European concepts, was lethally effective. Meanwhile, American pilots were rapidly learning to exploit their aircraft's unique capabilities. Major Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander, who had initially despised the P-47, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic. Thunderbolt formations would climb to maximum altitude, higher than German fighters could effectively operate, then dive on enemy aircraft at speeds that made deflection shooting impossible. The psychological warfare was as important as the tactical innovation. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s described the terrifying sound of 8 synchronized machine guns. They called it Roosevelt's buzzsaw after the American president. The deep mechanical roar could be heard from miles away, announcing the approach of American firepower. By November 1943, German attitudes were beginning to shift. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II wrote in his combat diary, "The American Thunderbolts are no longer objects of amusement. Their firepower is beyond anything we've faced. When those 8 guns converge, aircraft simply cease to exist." The transformation was accelerating as more P-47 groups arrived in Europe, and veteran American pilots shared their hard-won knowledge. The fat, ugly fighter that Germans had mocked was revealing capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat. Speed could be more valuable than maneuverability. Firepower could compensate for handling deficiencies. Industrial mass production could create weapons that individual craftsmanship couldn't match. The evidence was mounting with each passing week. German pilots who had once joked about American incompetence were filing increasingly sobering combat reports. The Thunderbolt's reputation spread through Luftwaffe squadrons like wildfire, transforming from comedy to cautionary tale to outright dread. December 1943 brought winter weather that should have favored German defenders operating from familiar bases with shorter supply lines. Instead, it marked the beginning of systematic destruction. American bomber formations, escorted by growing numbers of P-47s, penetrated deeper into German airspace with impunity. The Thunderbolts that had struggled to reach the German border in spring were now ranging over the heart of the Reich. The secret lay in external fuel tanks that transformed the short-legged interceptor into a long-range escort fighter. Drop tanks carrying 75 to 200 gallons extended the P-47's combat radius to over 400 miles. More importantly, the Thunderbolt could fight effectively immediately after dropping external fuel, unlike German fighters whose performance suffered dramatically when carrying additional weight. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, encountered this reality during a December intercept mission near Munich. His formation of 20 Messerschmitt 109s climbed to engage what appeared to be vulnerable bombers protected by a handful of escort fighters. As the German fighters approached, dozens of P-47s materialized from high altitude, diving with the speed of meteors. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. When it had lost 7, ended Steinhoff's squadron aircraft. The Americans hadn't lost a single plane. The mathematical precision of their attack defied German understanding of aerial combat. Each Thunderbolt seemed to know exactly where every other American fighter was positioned, coordinating their attacks with supernatural efficiency. What Steinhoff couldn't comprehend was that every P-47 carried sophisticated radio equipment that enabled real-time coordination across the entire formation. While German fighters relied on hand signals and rigid tactical formations, American pilots communicated continuously, adjusting their attacks based on information shared instantaneously across their formation. The technology gap extended beyond communications. American pilots wore electrically heated flight suits that kept them comfortable at altitudes where German aviators suffered from debilitating cold. Oxygen systems in P-47s functioned reliably at extreme altitudes, while Luftwaffe pilots frequently experienced hypoxia that degraded their combat effectiveness. More fundamentally, American training methods produced pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities intimately. Each P-47 pilot received over 200 hours of flight training before entering combat, including extensive gunnery practice against towed targets. They arrived in Europe knowing exactly how to employ their weapon systems for maximum effect. German pilot training, constrained by fuel shortages and accelerated by combat losses, had deteriorated drastically. New Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with less than 60 hours of flight time and minimal gunnery training. They faced American opponents who had practiced their craft extensively before firing their first shot in anger. The disparity showed in engagement statistics. American pilots achieved hits with approximately 15% of their ammunition. German pilots, despite superior individual marksmanship traditions, managed only 8% accuracy due to inadequate training and inferior gun sights. January 1944 introduced German pilots to an even more terrifying variant of the Thunderbolt. The P-47D featured a new Hamilton standard propeller with paddle-shaped blades that dramatically improved climb performance. The massive four-bladed propeller, 13 feet in diameter, bit into the air with unprecedented efficiency. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, one of Germany's most successful bomber-destroyers, encountered the new variant during an intercept mission over Frankfurt. His usual tactic involved climbing above American formations, then diving through the bombers before escort fighters could react. This time, the P-47s climbed with him. At 30,000 feet, where Meyer expected his Messerschmitt to have decisive altitude advantage, the Thunderbolts matched his climb rate. When he attempted to disengage by diving away, the Americans followed him down, their superior diving speed making escape impossible. Meyer's aircraft absorbed devastating damage from multiple P-47s converging from different angles. He survived only because his parachute deployed after he was thrown clear of his disintegrating fighter. From his parachute harness, drifting down through the thin air, Meyer watched American fighters continue their methodical destruction of his squadron. The precision was mechanical, relentless, inexorable. The psychological impact on German pilots was becoming measurable. Medical officers reported increasing cases of what they termed Jagdfieber, literally fighter fever, a condition characterized by anxiety, insomnia, and tremors among aircrew. Pilots who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching developed physical symptoms when briefed for missions where P-47s might be encountered. The sound signature of approaching Thunderbolts became a source of particular dread. The distinctive thunder of Wright Cyclone engines running at high power settings could be heard from miles away. German ground troops learned to recognize the sound and sought immediate cover. Unlike the sharp whine of German fighters or the smooth purr of British aircraft, the American engines produced a deep mechanical roar that seemed to announce inevitable destruction. February 1944 marked what historians would later identify as the turning point in the air war over Europe. Operation Argument, the coordinated assault on German aircraft production facilities, demonstrated American air power at its devastating peak. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, including 600 P-47s, struck targets across Germany in broad daylight. The Luftwaffe's response was massive but futile. Over 400 German fighters rose to challenge the American formations. The result was catastrophic for German aviation. In 6 days of continuous combat, the Luftwaffe lost 355 aircraft and 230 irreplaceable pilots. American losses totaled 226 bombers and 28 fighters. The mathematics were stark. For every P-47 destroyed, German forces lost over 12 aircraft. The exchange rate made continued resistance mathematically impossible. At current loss ratios, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective force within months. More devastating than the numbers was the quality of German losses. Experienced squadron leaders, flight instructors, and veteran pilots were being systematically eliminated. Each death represented hundreds of hours of training and years of combat experience that could never be replaced under wartime conditions. General Major Adolf Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, understood the implications immediately. In a desperate meeting with Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, he presented statistics that painted an apocalyptic picture. German fighter production, despite reaching record levels, couldn't replace losses. Pilot training programs, accelerated to dangerous extremes, couldn't produce competent air crews fast enough. The Americans have achieved what we thought impossible, Galland reported. They have created a fighter that transforms industrial capacity into combat effectiveness. Each P-47 represents not just an aircraft, but an entire system of production, training, and logistics that we cannot match. Göring's response revealed the depth of German delusion. He dismissed Galland's assessment as defeatism, insisting that German technical superiority would ultimately prevail. The Reich Marshal ordered development of new superweapons that would restore air superiority through technological advancement rather than industrial capacity. This fundamental misunderstanding of American methods would prove fatal. While German engineers pursued incremental improvements to existing designs, American factories were mass-producing proven weapons in quantities that overwhelmed any qualitative advantage. The P-47 represented American industrial philosophy perfectly. Not the best possible fighter, but the best fighter that could be built in the numbers required to win. By March 1944, P-47 production had reached its stride. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale facility on Long Island was completing one Thunderbolt every hour around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from farmland in just 18 months, produced 500 aircraft monthly. Combined production exceeded German output of all fighter types. Each P-47 required 65,000 individual components manufactured to precise tolerances. The engine alone contained 2,400 separate parts, machined to thousandths of an inch accuracy. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with reliability that exceeded peacetime standards. The ammunition production supporting P-47 operations was equally staggering. Each combat sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, consumption exceeded 10 million rounds monthly. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition plants, produced 30 million rounds monthly while maintaining quality standards that ensured reliable feeding through synchronized gun mechanisms. Quality control in American ammunition production reached obsessive levels. Each cartridge case was inspected, every powder charge weighed, each projectile examined for defects. The result was ammunition that functioned flawlessly in combat conditions, giving American pilots confidence their weapons would fire when needed. German ammunition production, by contrast, suffered from material shortages and quality compromises that reduced reliability. Luftwaffe pilots frequently experienced gun stoppages during critical moments, a failure that could prove fatal when facing American fighters with perfectly functioning weapons systems. The contrast extended to maintenance and logistics. Each P-47 squadron received detailed technical manuals, abundant spare parts, and specialized tools. American ground crews could replace engines, overhaul gun systems, and repair battle damage using standardized procedures and interchangeable components. German maintenance relied increasingly on improvisation and cannibalization. Spare parts were scarce, technical documentation was often missing, and specialized tools were unavailable. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks, awaiting repairs that American crews completed in hours. The fuel situation created another dimension of American superiority that German pilots couldn't comprehend. P-47S operated with fuel abundance that bordered on the wasteful by European standards. American logistics delivered aviation gasoline in quantities that allowed extended training flights, practice missions, and combat operations without rationing concerns. Major Francis Gabreski recalled the luxury of unlimited fuel during training. We could fly 3 hours daily, practicing gunnery and formation work. German pilots we captured told us they were lucky to get 30 minutes of flight time weekly by 1944. How could they compete against pilots who had practiced their craft extensively? The psychological advantage of fuel abundance extended beyond training. American pilots entered combat knowing they could maneuver aggressively, climb to maximum altitude, and engage in extended dogfights without monitoring fuel gauges. German aviators, conditioned by years of fuel rationing, unconsciously conserve power settings that reduce their aircraft's performance at critical moments. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke discovered this phenomenon during interrogations of captured German pilots. They flew their aircraft like old ladies driving to church, he observed, always worried about fuel consumption, always thinking about getting home. We flew like we had unlimited gas because we did. Spring 1944 brought the P-47's evolution into a multi-role destroyer that terrified German ground forces as much as aircrew. The addition of external bomb racks transformed Thunderbolts into fighter bombers capable of carrying ordnance loads equivalent to medium bombers. 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, plus a 500-pound bomb beneath the fuselage, gave each aircraft devastating ground attack capability. The transition from pure fighter to fighter-bomber revealed another dimension of American industrial thinking. Rather than designing separate aircraft for different missions, engineers created versatile platforms that could adapt to changing tactical requirements. The same P-47 that destroyed German fighters at 25,000 feet could attack ground targets with precision bombing, then climb back to altitude for air-to-air combat. German defenders faced an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing week. Thunderbolts that appeared as high-altitude escorts in the morning returned as low-level attackers in the afternoon. The psychological effect was devastating. No German position was safe from aircraft that could strike from any altitude at any time. Oberst Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated ground attack pilot, experienced P-47 capabilities firsthand during missions over France. "They came at us from above and below simultaneously," he recorded. "When we climbed to escape the low-level attacks, high-altitude Thunderbolts dove on us. When we descended to avoid the high fighters, more P-47s appeared at treetop level. They seemed to be everywhere." The rocket armament that appeared on P-47s in mid-1944 completed their transformation into aerial artillery. High-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell, could destroy German armour at ranges where return fire was impossible. Tank crews who survived P-47 rocket attacks described the experience as facing an invisible enemy that struck without warning. Hauptmann Michael Wittmann, Germany's most successful tank ace, encountered rocket-armed Thunderbolts during the Normandy campaign. His Tiger tank, nearly invulnerable to most Allied weapons, was disabled by rocket fragments that penetrated vision ports and damaged track systems. Wittmann escaped on foot, but his faith in German armour superiority was shattered. "The Americans attack from positions where we cannot see them," he reported. "Their rockets arrive before we hear their engines. How do you fight an enemy who can destroy you from beyond visual range?" The answer was that German forces couldn't fight such enemies effectively. P-47 pilots had discovered that high-speed diving attacks from extreme altitude made German anti-aircraft fire largely ineffective. By the time ground gunners acquired targets, the attacking Thunderbolts were already climbing back to safety at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. German flak crews, despite operating some of the war's most sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, achieved hit rates against P-47s of less than 1%. The combination of high approach speed, brief target exposure, and immediate high-speed egress made Thunderbolts nearly invulnerable to ground fire. June 6, 1944, demonstrated American air power coordination at unprecedented levels. Over 2,000 P-47s participated in D-Day operations, providing air cover that rendered German air response virtually impossible. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties against thousands of Allied aircraft, achieving negligible results while suffering catastrophic losses. Oberst Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked P-47s as flying refrigerators 18 months earlier, led one of the few German attempts to attack the invasion beaches. His two-aircraft formation faced an aerial armada that defied comprehension. Thunderbolts stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet created an impenetrable shield over Allied forces. "We flew through walls of American fighters," Priller reported after his harrowing mission. "Every altitude was occupied by Thunderbolts. We couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them, couldn't turn around them. The sky belonged to America." The transformation in German attitudes was complete. Pilots who had approached P-47s with contempt now spoke of them with grudging respect that bordered on fear. The ungainly fighter that couldn't turn or climb had become the master of European skies through overwhelming firepower, superior tactics, and industrial abundance. Combat reports from summer 1944 revealed the psychological dominance American fighters had achieved. German pilots increasingly avoided combat when P-47s were present, seeking to escape rather than engage. When forced to fight, they attacked desperately and disengaged rapidly, hoping to survive encounters with aircraft they could no longer match. The statistics told an inexorable story. German fighter losses in 1944 exceeded production by margins that made continued resistance mathematically impossible. Each month brought fresh American pilots flying factory-new Thunderbolts, while German squadrons operated with skeleton crews, flying patched aircraft. Training disparities had become grotesque. American replacement pilots arrived with over 200 hours of flight time and extensive gunnery practice. German replacements entered combat with less than 40 hours total time and minimal weapons training. The results were predictable and tragic. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, now an experienced ace with multiple victories, described the one-sided nature of late-war combat. New German pilots were flying obsolete tactics in worn-out aircraft. They had courage but no training, determination but no fuel, spirit but no ammunition. It was slaughter disguised as air combat. The industrial statistics supporting American operations revealed the true scope of their achievement. By late 1944, the United States was producing more P-47s monthly than Germany manufactured of all aircraft types. American training schools graduated more pilots weekly than German facilities could produce monthly. Maintenance capabilities demonstrated similar disparities. American squadrons could completely rebuild engines, replace entire wing sections, and overhaul complex systems using abundant spare parts and specialized equipment. German maintenance involved increasingly desperate improvisation with salvage components and makeshift repairs. The ammunition expenditure supporting P-47 operations exceeded German production by factors that rendered comparison meaningless. American fighters fired more rounds in practice than German aircraft carried into combat. Training exercises consumed quantities of ammunition that would have supplied entire Luftwaffe fighter wings for months. Quality control in American manufacturing reached obsessive levels that German industry couldn't approach under wartime conditions. Each P-47 underwent extensive testing before delivery, ensuring that aircraft reached combat units in perfect condition. German fighters increasingly left factories with known defects that couldn't be corrected due to material shortages and production pressure. The contrast in pilot equipment revealed American attention to details that German forces had abandoned as luxuries. P-47 pilots wore electrically heated flight suits, used sophisticated oxygen systems, and communicated through noise-cancelling headphones. German aviators endured inadequate heating, unreliable oxygen equipment, and communication systems that failed regularly. Medical support for American aircrews exceeded German standards by margins that affected combat effectiveness directly. Flight surgeons monitored pilot health meticulously, ensuring that aircrew entered combat in peak physical condition. German pilots flew missions while suffering from malnutrition, fatigue, and untreated injuries that degraded their performance significantly. The psychological warfare aspect of P-47 operations became increasingly sophisticated as American commanders recognized its value. The distinctive sound of Thunderbolt engines was deliberately emphasized during low-level passes over German positions, creating terror among ground troops who associated the noise with incoming destruction. German soldiers developed conditioned responses to the sound of approaching P-47s that bordered on panic. Medical officers reported increasing cases of what they termed jabbo fever among troops exposed to repeated fighter-bomber attacks. The mere sound of aircraft engines, even friendly ones, triggered stress responses that affected combat effectiveness. By autumn 1944, the transformation was complete. The P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from object of ridicule to instrument of systematic destruction. German pilots, who survived encounters with American fighters, carried psychological scars that never healed. The fat, ugly fighter had proven that industrial warfare rewarded different virtues than traditional combat. The laughter that had greeted the P-47's combat debut had died in the throats of German aviators, who learned too late that American methods produced results regardless of aesthetic preferences. 8 synchronized machine guns had spoken with authority that no amount of tactical brilliance could answer. The Thunderbolt's reign of terror was just beginning, and German skies would never be safe again. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt stands as testament to a fundamental truth about modern warfare. When industrial might meets tactical innovation, even the most experienced enemies can find themselves outmatched by forces they never saw coming. Those German pilots who laughed at the ungainly American fighters in October 1943 learned a lesson written in tracer fire and falling aircraft. Superior craftsmanship means nothing when facing unlimited production. Individual brilliance cannot overcome systematic excellence. The 850 caliber machine guns that seemed inadequate compared to German cannon proved devastatingly effective when fired in synchronized volleys by well-trained pilots flying aircraft built to absorb punishment and deliver destruction. The Thunderbolt's transformation from comedy to nightmare demonstrates how quickly assumptions can become fatal errors in combat. German laughter turned to silence as P-47s established dominance over European skies through sheer overwhelming capability. The fat fighter that couldn't turn or climb had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare through industrial logic that valued effectiveness over elegance. By war's end, the sound of 8 synchronized machine guns had become the signature of American air power, announcing destruction from altitudes where German fighters could no longer reach. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt proved that in industrial warfare, the side with superior resources and production capacity will ultimately prevail, regardless of initial tactical advantages. Those who underestimate American engineering and manufacturing capability do so at their own peril.